the edge of sleep, history exhales its coldest secrets, not with screams but with silence, the kind that settles into your bones and waits, patient, for you to notice too late that it has already begun around you now. Many listen quietly here, night after night. If this calm travels with you, you may stay. Subscribing keeps this silence alive. The night begins quietly, the way dangerous things often do. No thunder, no warning bells, just wind, long and patient, sliding across an empty stretch of prairie as if it has nowhere better to be. It presses against wooden walls, slips through the cracks between poorly cut boards, and hums a low, steady note that frontier families had heard 1,000 times before. This was not an unusual sound. This was simply winter, arriving the way winter always claimed to arrive. Calm, familiar, almost polite. Inside small houses scattered across the American frontier, lamps burned low. Children slept beneath quilts that had been mended more times than anyone cared to count. Adults lay awake, not because of fear, but because the wind was loud enough to be mildly annoying. Someone, somewhere, probably thought, it's going to be cold tomorrow. And then they turned over and tried to sleep again. Nothing dramatic happened that night. And that is precisely the problem. Because the long winter of 1880 did not announce itself with spectacle. It did not kick down doors or arrive wrapped in tragedy. It simply stayed. One cold night became two. Two became weeks. Weeks quietly turned into months. And before anyone fully understood what was happening, winter had stopped behaving like a season and started acting more like a decision. History books like neat beginnings. They enjoy clean dates and sharp edges, but real suffering rarely cooperates. The long winter of 1880 did not begin with panic. It began with routine, with people doing exactly what they had always done, confident in the belief that experience had prepared them. After all, these were frontier families. They knew cold. They knew snow. They had survived winters before. Many of them had crossed continents under worse conditions, or so they liked to believe. People tend to assume familiarity equals mastery. History enjoys proving otherwise. The phrase long winter sounds almost poetic, even harmless. It suggests inconvenience, maybe boredom, something to be endured with patience and an extra blanket. But this was not a winter that tested comfort. This was a winter that tested systems, supply lines, assumptions, optimism, the quiet confidence that tomorrow would be roughly similar to today. No one died immediately. No one collapsed in the snow in some cinematic moment of despair. And that, oddly enough, is what made it unsettling. When disaster arrives slowly, it invites denial. At first, frontier families treated the cold the way they always had. Fires were built higher, doors were sealed tighter, jokes were made about frozen beards and stiff boots. Someone probably said winter was really committing this year, and everyone laughed because humor is cheaper than panic. They did not yet understand that the cold was not passing through. It was settling in, unpacking, making itself at home. The long winter of 1880 stretched across large parts of the northern plains, especially in places like the Dakota Territory. These were communities built on thin margins. Crops had already been harvested. Supplies had been calculated carefully, optimistically, perhaps even generously. No one plans for infinity. No one stocks food for a season that refuses to end. But at the beginning, no one thought they needed to. There is something deeply human about assuming tomorrow We'll behave. The snow came early, then it stayed late. Storms followed storms with no meaningful pause between them. Trains stopped running, roads vanished under white silence. Communication slowed, then failed entirely. But even then, death did not rush in. Instead, something quieter took its place. Waiting, counting, measuring meals, listening to the wind the way sailors listen to waves, searching for changes that might signal relief. This is where the long winter becomes truly uncomfortable to sit with, because it was not a single catastrophe. It was a long conversation between people and the environment was doing most of the talking. Every day asked the same question in slightly different tones. How long can you keep this up? The frontier had always been sold as a place of control, land to be claimed, nature to be conquered. The American imagination loved the idea that grit and hard work could bend the world into something manageable. Winter in this story was just another obstacle, a seasonal inconvenience, something men shook hands with, something women planned around, something children complained about, until spring rescued everyone right on schedule. The long winter did not follow the script. Out there on the plains, far from cities and certainty, people had built lives on confidence, confidence in their tools, confidence in their neighbors, confidence in the idea that nature, while harsh, was ultimately predictable. And for a while that confidence held. It always does, until it doesn't. History has a quiet sense of humor like that. No one died immediately. There were no dramatic opening acts, no mass graves carved into the snow before anyone understood the danger. Instead, there were days that looked almost normal, just colder, nights that felt slightly longer, silence where movement used to be, the unsettling realization that the usual signs of change simply were not coming. And that is what made this winter different from all the others. This was not about survival skills alone. This was about patience stretched thin, about hope rationed as carefully as flour, about families discovering that endurance has limits, and those limits are rarely announced in advance. The cold did not shout. It whispered. It waited. It allowed people to believe they were managing things right up until the moment they weren't. The frontier had taught them to trust themselves. The long winter would teach them something else entirely. As the wind continued its endless work across the prairie, it carried no message of mercy, just persistence. And somewhere between one quiet night and the next, winter stopped being a season and became a presence. Not violent, not dramatic, just relentless. And the people who believed they had mastered it were about to learn how little mastery actually meant, because this was a winter. Yes, but not like any other winter they had known before. The American frontier, where hope always arrived before food. To understand why the long winter of 1880 hurt as deeply as it did, you have to step back, away from the snow for a moment, and look at the people who chose to stand in its path. Because no one ended up on the American frontier by accident. They came on purpose, with intention, with optimism that bordered, at times, on professional-level denial. The frontier was not just land. It was an idea, a promise whispered across oceans and cities, passed from neighbor to neighbor, folded into pamphlets and speeches. It was the belief that if you moved far enough west, the rules would change in your favor. That hard work would finally receive the respect it deserved. That land, wide and empty, was waiting specifically for you. Families packed their lives into wagons not because it was easy, but because it was hopeful. They were farmers squeezed by debt, immigrants tired of crowded streets, veterans looking for a fresh beginning that did not smell like gunpowder. The frontier offered something intoxicating: ownership. A piece of earth you could point to and say, "This will feed us." Of course, the land never promised anything back. Daily life on the frontier was simple in structure and brutal in detail. Houses were small, usually wooden, built quickly because time was expensive and winter was always coming soon. Walls were thin, floors creaked, roofs leaked when they felt like it. These were not homes designed for comfort. They were shelters built on optimism and hope that tomorrow would cooperate. Food was everything. Crops dictated moods, harvest determined futures. A good yield meant confidence. A bad one meant quiet worry spoken only at night. Families measured their success not in money but in barrels, sacks, and jars. Flour, salt pork, beans. Anything that could last through the winter months when the land went silent. Winters, importantly, were expected, planned for, budgeted. Frontier families were not naive about cold. They knew snow. They had survived blizzards before, but they survived them the way you survive a known problem. By calculating, estimating, and trusting averages. You stored enough food for a normal winter. You chopped enough wood for a normal winter. You trusted that spring would show up more or less on time, like it usually did. History enjoys punishing averages. Most frontier homes had pantries that looked impressive in October and concerning by January. Supplies were meant to dwindle. That was part of the design. You were supposed to feel the stretch. The system relied on movement, trains, wagons, trade. If something ran short, you could usually buy, borrow, or barter. The frontier was harsh, yes, but it was connected. Or at least it liked to think so. And this is where the fragility hides. These communities functioned like a carefully balanced trick. Everything worked as long as nothing went wrong for too long. Crops failed sometimes, but not everywhere at once. Snowstorms happened, but they passed. Rail lines stalled, but they restarted. The system did not need perfection. It only needed consistency. What it did not need was a winter that refused to leave. Frontier families arrived carrying what they believed were the essentials of civilization: tools, seeds, family Bibles, a deep faith that effort would be rewarded eventually. They also brought recipes, routines, and traditions that assumed the environment would behave in recognizable ways. Meals planned around seasons, work days structured around daylight, children raised with the understanding that hardship had an end date. They carried hope generously. Supplies, less so. There is a quiet irony in how carefully these families planned and how unprepared they still were. They built barns strong enough to survive storms that did not stop. They stored food for winters that ended. They trusted neighbors who lived miles away, connected by paths that would soon vanish under snow. Everything made sense, right up until it didn't. The frontier system of survival was not foolish. It was efficient. It worked most of the time, but it left very little room for error. And winter, as it turns out, does not respect margins. People joked about it even then, about how they had brought the Word of God, the American dream, and just enough flour to feel confident. Someone once said, probably with a smile, that they had packed faith more carefully than firewood. It was meant to be funny. And it was, until it wasn't. Wood piles shrank faster than expected. Flour barrels sounded emptier when tapped. Meals grew quieter, not because there was less conversation, but because there was less to chew on. Still, optimism held. It usually does at the beginning of trouble. People told themselves stories about past winters, about how cold always feels worse when it arrives early, about how spring would come roaring back and make this whole thing feel silly in retrospect. The frontier thrived on stories like that, but somewhere subtle changes began to slip through the cracks. Snow fell earlier than expected, not unheard of, but noticeable. Temperatures dropped harder, faster, winds lingered longer, trains missed schedules, then missed them again. Roads became suggestions rather than guarantees. These were small things. In isolation, none of them deserved panic. Together, they formed a pattern no one wanted to name. What made the situation especially dangerous was how reasonable everyone remained. There was no chaos, no screaming in the streets, just people adapting, adjusting, conserving, doing what sensible people do. And that is often the most unsettling part of historical disasters. How normal they look while they are still forming. The frontier had taught these families to believe in self-reliance, and to a point, that belief served them well. They fixed what broke, shared when they could, endured when necessary. But self-reliance taken too far becomes isolation, and isolation, in a winter that does not move on, becomes a trap. No one stood up one morning and said, "This winter is different." Instead, they noticed small absences. No mail, no visitors, no sound beyond the wind. The world outside their homes grew quieter, flatter, more distant. It was as if the frontier itself had paused, waiting to see what would happen next. The tragedy of the long winter did not begin with starvation or death. It began with confidence slowly eroding, with the realization that the systems everyone trusted were thinner than they appeared. That hope, while abundant, could not be burned for warmth or ground into flour. And still they waited. Because that is what frontier families were good at. Waiting, enduring, believing that tomorrow would eventually explain itself. They had come west, believing they could shape the land. The long winter was about to show them that sometimes the land shapes you instead. And as the first truly abnormal signs settled in, the kind that lingered just long enough to feel wrong, the stage was set. Not for panic, not yet, but for something quieter, heavier, and far more dangerous. A winter that did not intend to behave. Snow fell early, and no one understood. It was a warning. The first snow of that season did not arrive like a threat. It drifted in gently, almost politely, as if it were testing the ground before committing. Soft flakes settled over the prairie, whitening the tall grass, smoothing the sharp edges of fences and wagon tracks. Children pressed their faces to windows. Adults noted the date, shrugged, and went back to work. Early snow was inconvenient, yes, but not alarming. Winter, after all, had a habit of being dramatic before calming down. Everyone had seen this before, or at least they believed they had. The wind, however, was different. Not stronger necessarily, just stranger. It lingered. It circled houses instead of passing through. It carried a dryness that stung the skin and pulled warmth from fingers faster than expected. People commented on it the way people comment on odd weather everywhere, briefly, casually, with no sense of urgency. Someone said it felt colder than it should. Someone else said that was just how early winter felt. End of discussion. Temperatures dropped sharply, then stayed there. Nights became uncomfortably cold earlier than planned. Water froze faster, fires needed more attention. Still, routines held. Chores were done, meals were cooked. Children were sent outside wrapped in layers stitched from old coats and optimism. Life continued, because life always continues right up until it can't. Denial is rarely loud. It hums quietly beneath daily tasks. Frontier families were experts at ignoring discomfort. It was a survival skill. You learned quickly not to panic every time the environment became unpleasant. Panic wasted energy. Panic made bad decisions. So people stayed calm. They told themselves that winter always felt worse before Christmas, that the body simply needed time to adjust, that this was not unusual, just inconvenient. And they were partly right. Nothing catastrophic had happened yet. No crops failed overnight. No one froze in their sleep. The snow was deep but manageable. Roads were still visible. Communication, though slowed, still existed. Everything looked like a harsher version of normal, which is exactly how prolonged danger likes to present itself. The frontier had trained people to trust patterns, and patterns, unfortunately, are excellent liars when conditions change. Snow usually melted after a few days. It always had. Cold snaps usually broke. They always did. So, when the snow stayed, when the cold did not loosen its grip, people assumed it was temporary stubbornness. Weather having a bad mood. Someone probably joked that winter had shown up early because it was eager this year. There is something deeply unsettling about how reasonable everyone was. They did not freeze in terror. They adjusted. They layered clothing. They burned a little more wood than planned. They measured food with slightly more care. But they did not fundamentally change their behavior, because fundamentally changing your behavior requires admitting that the rules have changed. And that is a hard thing to do without proof. The snow kept falling, not always heavily. Sometimes it drifted down in thin, endless sheets. Sometimes it arrived in sharp storms that erased landmarks and left silence behind. The prairie began to look the same in every direction. White, flat, endless. Familiar paths disappeared beneath layers of quiet. Travel became slower, then cautious, then rare. Still people waited for the melt. Days passed, the snow did not retreat. It compacted, hardened, settled into itself. New snow fell on top of old snow, and the ground beneath stopped breathing. Livestock struggled, wagons sank, doors opened with effort. Small inconveniences stacked up, one on top of another like the snow itself. Yet even then, no one declared an emergency. This is the dangerous space where the long winter truly began, not in the cold itself, but in the gap between expectation and reality. People expected change, relief, variation, but the weather offered none. It repeated itself with dull precision. Cold morning, cold afternoon, colder night. Wind, silence, snow. The wind in particular began to feel personal. It found every weakness in every structure. It crept through seams under doors, along floors. It extinguished lamps and rattled loose boards. It made houses feel temporary, fragile, like suggestions rather than shelters. At night, it howled across the prairie, a sound that was not violent but persistent, as if it were asking the same question over and over again. How long do you plan to stay? People still went about their days. Work continued. Animals were fed. Repairs were made. Life narrowed but did not collapse. And that narrowing was subtle. Hours were spent indoors. Conversations grew quieter. The outside world felt farther away, even when it was only a few steps beyond the door. There is a particular unease that comes from waiting for something to end when you do not know how long it intends to stay. Each morning brought a small, private hope. Maybe today would be different. Maybe the temperature would rise, maybe the snow would soften. But each morning delivered the same answer, calmly, without explanation. No, people always believe winter will be polite, that it will follow the schedule everyone agreed on, that it will arrive, perform its role, and then step aside. The long winter had no interest in manners. It did not escalate dramatically. It simply refused to leave. Frontier communities notice the change in the way you notice a headache that doesn't go away. Slowly, with mild concern at first, then irritation, then the creeping realization that something is wrong. Mail deliveries stopped. News grew old before it arrived. Visitors became rare, then non-existent. The outside world faded into memory. The silence became heavier than the snow. Inside homes, fires burned longer. Wood supplies dropped faster. Meals became simpler. Bread was thinner. Portions slightly smaller. No one announced rationing, but everyone practiced it, quietly, politely, as if naming the behavior might make it permanent. Children adapted more easily than adults. They always do. Snow was still snow to them. Cold was still cold. They found ways to play indoors, to invent games that required little space and no warmth. Adults watched them with a mixture of relief and unease, wondering how long innocence could last if the environment refused to cooperate. And still, no one panicked. Because panic implies urgency, and urgency implies that something immediate is about to happen. But the long winter was not immediate. It was slow, methodical, patient. It allowed people to believe they were coping even as their margins thinned. It allowed them to believe that tomorrow would fix what today could not. The true warning was not the snow itself. It was what the snow did not do. It did not melt. Days warmed slightly, then cooled again. Sunlight appeared, weak and distant, reflecting off the endless white without offering heat. The ground remained locked. The snow hardened into layers that resisted boots and blades alike. It stopped behaving like weather and started behaving like geography. At some point, though no one could say exactly when, people realized they had stopped asking, "When will this end?" and started asking, "How much longer can we last?" That shift was quiet. It happened in kitchens and barns, in the careful way food was measured, in the way people stared at the sky without expectation. The snow did not melt, it stayed. And with that simple, stubborn fact, the long winter crossed an invisible line. What had been uncomfortable became unsettling. What had been familiar became strange. And the frontier families, still calm, still reasonable, stood unknowingly at the edge of something far more serious than cold. Because winter, it turned out, had no intention of being polite. when the world shrinks to four wooden walls. At some point, the storms stopped being events and started becoming background noise. Blizzard followed blizzard with such regularity that people no longer marked their arrival. Snow no longer announced itself. It simply continued. The sky stayed the same dull, exhausted gray, as if even the heavens had grown tired of variation. Wind erased tracks as quickly as they appeared, and the land outside each home became an abstract idea rather than a usable space. This was the moment the world began to shrink. What had once been miles of open prairie, dotted with fences and distant neighbors, collapsed inward until it ended at the front door. Beyond that door was cold, movement, resistance. Inside was stillness, containment. Four wooden walls that were never meant to hold an entire existence, now tasked with doing exactly that. Blizzards layered themselves on top of one another, each one erasing the memory of the last. Snow fell sideways, upward, inward. It found every crack, every weakness. Doors groaned under pressure, windows iced over until daylight became a suggestion rather than a certainty. The outside world did not disappear dramatically. It simply faded, slowly, until leaving the house felt less like a decision and more like a gamble. Families became islands. Neighbors who once lived a short walk away might as well have been across an ocean. Paths vanished, familiar landmarks dissolved into uniform whiteness. Even sound changed. The prairie, once alive with wind and distance, went strangely quiet between storms, muffled by snow thick enough to absorb echoes. When the wind returned, it did so violently, shaking structures as if testing their honesty. Inside, life compressed. Rooms took on multiple identities. Kitchens became bedrooms. Bedrooms became storage. Tables served as workbenches, dining surfaces, and emotional gathering points. There was nowhere to go that was not already occupied by someone else's presence, breath, or thoughts. Privacy became a luxury, quietly mourned and then forgotten. Time behaved differently here. Without clear markers of day and night, hours blurred, lamps burned longer, shadows stretched and shrank unpredictably. People slept when exhaustion demanded it and woke without knowing whether it was morning or late afternoon. Days were no longer counted by calendars, but by meals, by storms, by how much wood remained stacked near the hearth. The oil lamp became a small sun, fragile and sacred. Its light was warm but limited, carving soft circles of visibility into the dark. Outside those circles, the house felt larger, older, full of corners that whispered. The flicker of the flame made shadows breathe. Faces shifted. Walls leaned inward and then pulled back, as if listening. Breath became visible even indoors on the coldest nights. It hung briefly in the air before dissolving, a quiet reminder that warmth was temporary. People pulled blankets tighter, layered clothing even while sleeping. Children learned to stay still to preserve heat. Adults learned to wake at the smallest change in sound, ready to tend the fire before it failed them. The wind never truly stopped. It pressed against the house constantly, sometimes screaming, sometimes sighing. It rattled loose boards, tapped at windows, slid beneath doors, like an unwanted guest who refused to leave. At night, it made the house feel less like shelter and more like an argument. Wood creaked, nails protested, beams shifted slightly, reminding everyone that these structures were compromises, not fortresses. Conversation changed. There was less small talk, fewer unnecessary words. People spoke softly, not out of fear, but because loudness felt inappropriate in such a confined, fragile space. Silence stretched comfortably at first, then awkwardly, then heavily. Each person carried private calculations they did not always share. How much food remained, how much would, how many days they might endure if nothing changed. No one said the word trapped, but everyone felt it. Children sensed the tension even if they did not understand it. Their games became quieter, more contained. Laughter existed, but it echoed differently now, as if unsure whether it was welcome. Parents watched their children closely, measuring resilience in small behaviors, appetite, energy, curiosity. Every cough sounded louder. Every pause felt longer. The storms erased all sense of forward movement. There was no progress, only maintenance, keeping the fire alive, keeping everyone fed, keeping spirits intact. Days were spent preserving what already existed rather than building toward anything new. The future narrowed to the next meal, the next night, the next storm. And the storms kept coming. Snow piled high against walls, pressing inward like a physical weight. Doors became harder to open. Windows disappeared entirely beneath drifts. Houses looked less like homes and more like shapes buried alive. Digging became a daily task, a negotiation with the elements that often ended in exhaustion rather than victory. Isolation settled in quietly, the way cold does. It was not dramatic loneliness. It was a dull ache, a sense that the world had forgotten them, or worse, was simply indifferent. People wondered about others without knowing how to help or even communicate. Concern had nowhere to go. Time froze emotionally, even as it dragged physically. Each day felt endless, yet identical to the last. People lost track of weeks. Memories blurred. Events merged together until everything became during the storms. The idea of before felt distant. The idea of after felt theoretical. There was a subtle cruelty in how intact everything appeared. The houses still stood, the families were still alive, fires still burned. It looked like survival. But survival, stretched too thin, begins to resemble something else entirely. People measured their existence in sounds. The crackle of the fire, the hiss of the lamp, the distant roar of wind, the soft rhythm of breathing and sleep. Silence, when it came, was unsettling because it suggested change, and change had become something to fear. In the evenings, families gathered close, not for warmth alone, but for reassurance. Physical proximity became proof of continued existence. Stories were told, repeated, retold, not because they were entertaining, but because familiarity was comforting. The same words, the same jokes, the same endings. Humor still existed, faint and dry. Someone might remark with a tired smile that at least they were well acquainted with one another by now, that there were no secrets left. It was meant lightly. It landed heavily. Sleep offered no real escape. Dreams were restless, filled with movement and color that felt almost offensive after so much white. Waking brought the same room, the same walls, the same sounds. There was no sense of transition, just continuation. And still, no one came. No footsteps outside, no distant voices, no signs of relief. The frontier, once vast and full of promise, had collapsed into an interior existence defined by endurance. The outside world might as well have been a story told long ago. In this quiet confinement, something fundamental shifted. Survival was no longer about strength or ingenuity alone. It became psychological. How long could people live inside uncertainty without breaking? How much silence could they absorb? How many identical days could pass before hope thinned beyond usefulness? The long winter did not crush people with force. It pressed inward slowly, steadily, asking the same question every day without ever raising its voice. And as families sat beneath flickering lamplight, listening to the wind test the walls again and again, the question hung, unspoken in the air, heavier than the snow outside. If no one came, how long could they last? Hunger does not scream. It whispers every day. Hunger did not arrive all at once. It never does. It crept in quietly, politely, the way an unwelcome thought slips into the back of the mind and pretends it belongs there. At first, it was merely an adjustment. Portions grew slightly smaller. Meals became simpler. Seconds disappeared without ceremony. No one announced these changes. They happened the way sensible people make sensible decisions when circumstances require it. Everyone told themselves it was temporary. The pantry, once a reassuring presence, became something else entirely. People began to look at it not as storage, but as a countdown. Shelves were checked more often. Hands lingered on sacks of flour, on jars of beans, on whatever remained preserved from better months. Inventory became a quiet ritual, performed privately, then mentally revised again and again. Food stopped being food. It became math. Calories were counted without using numbers. A scoop of flour meant 3 meals, or perhaps 4, if stretched carefully. A piece of salt pork was no longer dinner, it was potential. Meals were planned days in advance, not based on preference, but on endurance. The question was no longer what should we eat, but how long can this last? Hunger did not hurt immediately. It whispered. At first it sounded like mild fatigue, a slower step, a longer rest after chores that now took place entirely indoors. People told themselves they were tired because winter was tiring, because confinement wore on the body, because everyone felt a little off during long, cold stretches. And that was true, enough to be convincing. Children complained less than expected, or perhaps adults simply learned to listen differently. Appetite came and went. Hunger sharpened some tempers and dulled others. Meals, once moments of warmth and conversation, became quiet, efficient affairs. People ate slowly, not to savor, but to make the moment last longer. The food itself changed. Bread grew darker, denser, thinner. Flour was stretched with whatever could be found. Grains were ground finer, then mixed with things that had never been intended for human consumption. Seed husks, bran meant for animals. Anything that could pass through teeth and into the stomach was considered, evaluated, and sometimes accepted. Hay was ground into something resembling flour. It tasted like exactly what it was. Livestock feed was repurposed carefully, cautiously, as if apologizing to the animals who no longer needed it. Soup became a method rather than a meal, a way to extract warmth and illusion from whatever remained. No one gagged dramatically. No one threw bowls across the room. They ate, quietly, slowly. Dinner was not good, but at least it existed. That sentence, or something like it, likely passed through more than one mind. It carried a tired sort of humor, the kind that doesn't ask for laughter. Dark, understated, practical. Humor as acknowledgement rather than relief. The body adjusted. That was the most unsettling part. Hunger did not escalate in a straight line. It flattened out, settled in, became a constant companion. Stomachs stopped growling so loudly. Energy declined in subtle ways. Tasks took longer. People sat more. Movements became economical, stripped of anything unnecessary. The cold made hunger sharper. Hunger made the cold feel closer. They fed each other in a quiet, relentless loop. Parents made decisions without announcing them. They ate less so children could eat more. They skipped meals casually, as if forgetting. They smiled while doing it because smiles cost nothing and bought a little peace. Children noticed anyway. They always do. But they learned quickly not to ask questions they already understood the answers to. The frontier had always demanded sacrifice. This was simply a deeper version of the same lesson. Or so people told themselves. As supplies dwindled, creativity expanded. Recipes became theories. Anything remotely edible was reconsidered. Roots, scraps. The last remnants of preserved food that had been saved for emergencies no one thought would actually arrive. Even then, people hesitated, because once the emergency food was gone, there was nothing left to pretend. The act of cooking changed. It slowed. It became deliberate. Fires were kept smaller to conserve fuel, which meant longer cooking times and colder kitchens. Pots simmered quietly as if aware of their importance. Steam rising from a thin soup felt almost luxurious. Hunger sharpened awareness. Smells became vivid. The memory of food haunted people more than the absence itself. Thoughts drifted toward meals from other times, other seasons. Fresh bread, meat cooked properly, vegetables that had not been reduced to concepts. These memories were both comfort and torture. Conversation shifted again. People talked less about weather and more about endurance, not openly but indirectly. Comments about how long supplies might last, about how spring was bound to arrive eventually, about how humans had survived worse things. These statements were not meant to be persuasive. They were rehearsals. Ethical lines blurred quietly. What counted as acceptable food changed, not through debate but through necessity. Decisions that would have seemed unthinkable months earlier were now considered calmly. There was no ceremony to these moments, no dramatic reckoning, just a quiet internal acknowledgement that survival had expanded its definition. The unsettling thing was how reasonable it all felt. Hunger did not turn people into monsters. It turned them into accountants of necessity. Moral choices were weighed against physical limits. Pride was negotiated with practicality. People discovered that ethics, like food, could be stretched, but not indefinitely. The body gave feedback slowly, dizziness when standing too quickly, a constant chill that no amount of layering seemed to fix, fatigue that sleep did not resolve. Illness lingered longer, small cuts healed slowly. These signs were noted, filed away, rarely discussed aloud, because speaking them would make them real. Hunger also altered time. Days revolved around meals that offered little satisfaction but significant structure. Without them, the day would collapse entirely. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, thin as they were, became anchors. Removing one felt dangerous, not just physically, but psychologically. The long winter did not starve people suddenly. It starved them politely, gradually, in a way that allowed adaptation, just enough to keep hope alive while quietly undermining strength. And hope itself began to change shape. It was no longer a bright, confident thing. It became cautious, conditional. Hope was measured not in certainty, but in possibility. If the snow melts soon, if someone comes, if the trains start running again. Hope learned to whisper the way hunger did. At night, lying awake beneath too many blankets that still failed to provide warmth, people thought about limits, not just of food, but of endurance. How long could the body function like this? How long could the mind remain steady when nourishment was inadequate and the future refused to clarify itself? These were not abstract questions. They were practical ones. The long winter forced frontier families into a space where survival was no longer about strength alone, but about choices that carried moral weight. How much to eat today versus tomorrow? Who needed more? What counted as enough? Where dignity fit into a life reduced to essentials. Hunger did not scream its demands. It whispered them day after day, calmly reminding everyone that time was not on their side. And somewhere in the quiet rhythm of thin meals and thinner hope, a deeper question began to form, one that had nothing to do with weather or supplies. How far could a person go and still recognize themselves on the other side? Children hope and the things adults would not say. If hunger whispered, fear learned to stay quiet in front of children. In the long winter, children became the emotional center of every home, not because they understood what was happening, but because adults reorganized themselves around protecting that lack of understanding. Parents measured their words. They edited their expressions. They learned to smile with precision, to sound confident, even when confidence had thinned into habit. Children, after all, were not supposed to carry the weight of seasons that refused to end. For the youngest, winter was still winter, cold was cold, snow was snow. It was inconvenient, boring, sometimes frightening, but not yet symbolic. They adapted in ways adults could not. They accepted confinement as normal more quickly. A room became a world. A corner became a kingdom. Toys were invented from scraps, from shadows, from nothing at all. Children are very good at surviving boredom. What they were less good at was misunderstanding silence. They noticed when voices lowered, when parents paused too long before answering simple questions, when meals became quieter, when plates were emptied faster, when adults insisted they had already eaten. Children noticed the way eyes lingered on food, on firewood, on the door. They felt the shift even if they could not name it. Adults lied gently, not with grand falsehoods, but with omissions, with tone, with reassurance stretched just enough to hold shape. Everything is fine. Spring will come soon. This is just how winter is sometimes. These sentences were repeated not to deceive children, but to protect them, and perhaps to protect the speaker as well. Fear spoken aloud has a way of growing. Children asked questions anyway, not the strategic kind, the innocent ones. Why can't we go outside today? Why is the soup different? Why is it always dark? Adults answered patiently, carefully, choosing explanations that avoided words like danger, running out, or if nothing changes. The long winter created moments so small they almost disappeared, and those were the moments that lingered the longest. A child offering half a piece of bread back to a parent, saying they weren't hungry. A parent refusing it with forced cheer, insisting children needed it more. Both knowing the truth, neither acknowledging it. Children learned restraint earlier than they should have. They learned to play quietly, to ask less, to move carefully so as not to disturb the fragile balance of warmth and calm inside the house. These were not lessons taught deliberately. They were absorbed instinctively, the way children absorb everything. Hope lived differently in children. Adults thought of hope as a calculation, based on weather patterns, supplies, distance. Children thought of hope as certainty. Of course, spring would come. It always did. Of course, things would get better. Stories always ended that way. Hope was not something they argued for. It was something they assumed, and that assumption hurt to witness. Parents watched their children believe and felt the weight of responsibility sharpen. If hope failed, it would not just disappoint adults. It would break something much more fragile. So adults fed that hope carefully, even when their own had grown thin. Evenings were the hardest. That was when the world narrowed most completely. Lamps lit, wind pressed close, snow piled silently against walls. Families gathered together not out of routine but necessity. Children leaned against parents, seeking warmth that was both physical and emotional. Stories were told again. Familiar ones, Bible passages, family memories, tales of warmer times. These stories were not meant to entertain so much as to anchor. They reminded everyone that a world existed beyond the walls, beyond the storm, beyond now. Children listened intently, sometimes correcting details, sometimes asking for the same story repeatedly. Adults obliged because repetition was soothing and because there were fewer new things to offer. Laughter still happened. Quiet laughter, unexpected laughter, the kind that surprised everyone and then faded quickly, leaving a sense of guilt behind, as if joy needed justification during hardship. Children slept closer to adults than they used to. Beds were shared not only for warmth, but for reassurance. Parents lay awake listening to breathing, counting rhythms, measuring peace in the rise and fall of small chests. Sleep was fragile. Children dreamed aloud sometimes, murmuring about green fields, animals, sunlight. Adults listened, eyes open in the dark, feeling both comforted and wounded by these sounds. Dreams came easily to children. Adults struggled to rest at all. The long winter forced adults into a role they had never rehearsed for, guardians not just of bodies, but of belief. They had to maintain the idea that the world was still trustworthy, even as evidence suggested otherwise. That tension wore on them. Small cracks appeared in composure, a voice raised too sharply, a pause that lasted too long, a look exchanged between adults when children weren't supposed to notice. But did. These moments passed quickly, smoothed over, but they accumulated. Children sensed that something was being hidden. They did not know what. Only the questions were sometimes redirected. That answers were simpler than expected. That grown-ups were tired in a way sleep did not fix. The cold sharpened everything. Illness worried parents more than it ever had before. A cough lingered too long. A fever burned too hot. With limited food and strength, Every small sickness felt like a test the family might not be able to afford. Parents stayed calm outwardly. Inwardly, they ran through scenarios they refused to speak aloud. The long winter taught children patience without explanation. It taught adults restraint with no reward. It created a strange emotional imbalance, children hopeful without understanding, adults understanding without hope. And yet, hope persisted, not as confidence, not as certainty, but as a fragile agreement between generations. Adults would continue to act as if spring were inevitable. Children would continue to believe it. Together they held the idea in place, even as the outside world refused to confirm it. Then came the questions that cut deepest. Not why is it cold or why can't we go out? But the quieter ones, asked casually without awareness of their weight. A child staring at a frost-covered window. A pause, then a simple question, spoken into the dim lamplight. When will spring come? It was asked without fear, without accusation, just curiosity, trusting that the answer existed. Adults answered carefully, vaguely, soon, when the snow melts, when the weather changes, words chosen not for accuracy but for comfort. Children nodded, satisfied enough, and returned to their games or their dreams. But long after the child had moved on, the question lingered in the air, because no one in the room actually knew the answer. And in that quiet uncertainty, beneath blankets and flickering light, the long winter pressed closer, not through cold or hunger alone, but through the unbearable responsibility of protecting hope, when even adults no longer knew how long it could last. When neighbors become a lifeline. At some point during the long winter, isolation stopped feeling heroic. The frontier ideal had always celebrated self-reliance. Strong families, independent households, a quiet pride in not needing anyone else. It sounded noble in good weather. In endless snow, it began to sound impractical, even dangerous. And so, slowly, reluctantly, something shifted. People started thinking about their neighbors again, not in the abstract way they had before, not as distant figures across the prairie, names remembered vaguely, faces seen occasionally at markets or church. Now neighbors became calculations, questions, possibilities. Are they still there? Do they have food? Are they worse off than we are? In a world reduced to 4 wooden walls, the idea that someone else was surviving nearby became oddly comforting. Reaching out was not easy. Snow still swallowed paths, wind still punished movement. Leaving the house meant risking what little strength remained. But desperation has a way of redefining risk. When supplies thinned enough, when silence stretched long enough, staying put began to feel just as dangerous as moving. The first attempts were cautious. A figure appeared through the snow, wrapped in layers, barely recognizable as human until close enough to speak. A knock at the door that sounded too loud in the quiet house. Surprise followed by relief, followed by the awkward realization that both households were probably hoping for the same thing. Help without having to ask for it outright. Visits were brief. No one lingered long in the cold, but words were exchanged. Information mattered now. Who had flour? Who had sick children? Who had seen movement on the roads? Knowledge itself became a resource. Food was shared carefully, Not generously, no one could afford generosity, but thoughtfully. A cup of flour exchanged for a piece of dried meat. A pot of soup divided between families so no one felt completely abandoned. These were not acts of charity. They were acts of mutual survival. Someone once joked, dryly, that neighbors were annoying, right up until you ran out of food. It earned a tired smile. The warmth that returned was not physical at first. It was psychological. Knowing you were not alone in the struggle changed something fundamental. Isolation makes suffering feel personal, as if it were a punishment. Shared hardship reframes it as circumstance. The long winter became less lonely, though no less dangerous. People coordinated when they could. Fires were tended in shifts when families gathered together. Children were brought into larger groups so adults could rest. Houses with more wood offered warmth to those with less. People slept close, not just to share heat, but to reassure one another that life was still happening. Communication networks formed quietly. Messages passed hand to hand. News traveled slowly but meaningfully. Someone had seen a train far off. Someone thought they heard that supplies might be coming. Rumors spread, but even rumors were valuable. They gave shape to the future, however uncertain. The frontier, which had once emphasized distance and independence, temporarily became communal. But this cooperation came with its own tension. Sharing resources meant acknowledging scarcity openly. It meant admitting vulnerability. It meant confronting the uncomfortable truth that not everyone would make it through unchanged. Decisions had to be made. Who needed help most? Who could spare what? Where limited strength should be directed. These were not easy calculations. They were emotional, moral, and deeply human. People discovered that generosity had limits, not because of selfishness, but because survival demanded boundaries. Every shared meal carried quiet arithmetic. Every offered blanket meant someone else would be colder. Cooperation did not erase fear. It redistributed it. Still, the presence of others softened the edges. Laughter returned occasionally, tentative but real. Someone shared a story about a winter years ago that seemed terrible at the time and now felt almost pleasant by comparison. The exaggeration was obvious. That was part of the comfort. Shared exaggeration implied shared endurance. Children benefited most. They played together again, inventing games that required little movement and no supplies. Their laughter filled rooms that had grown too quiet. Adults watched them carefully, aware that these moments were fragile but grateful they existed at all. Neighbors checked on one another more frequently. Absences were noticed. Silence raised concern. When a household did not respond, someone went to investigate, despite the cold, despite the danger. The frontier learned briefly to care outward instead of inward. This cooperation did not solve the problem. It delayed it. Food continued to dwindle. The cold persisted. The snow showed no interest in melting. The long winter allowed moments of connection, but it did not loosen its grip. If anything, the shared hardship made the stakes clearer. People could see the strain in one another now. Hollow cheeks, slow movements, exhaustion behind polite conversation. The illusion of control faded more quickly when reflected in someone else's eyes. And beneath the warmth of companionship lay an unspoken understanding. If help did not arrive from outside these small networks, Cooperation alone would not be enough. Still, people clung to it. Because when survival narrows, community becomes oxygen. It does not feed you, but it keeps you breathing. It makes the waiting bearable. It reminds you that suffering witnessed is suffering shared. The frontier families did not suddenly become saints. They remained practical, cautious, occasionally irritable, but they leaned toward one another rather than away. And in that subtle shift, the atmosphere changed. Hope, thin as it was, found something to attach itself to. Someone would come, someone would break through. Someone had to. And as neighbors huddled together under low lamplight, sharing heat, food, and half-formed rumors, they did not yet know that the most dangerous part of the long winter was still ahead, because cooperation can soften hardship, but it cannot stop what comes next. Relief, quiet heroes, and journeys that were almost suicide. Hope, once shared among neighbors, eventually demanded movement. Waiting had carried people as far as it could. Cooperation had softened the edges of despair, but it had not changed the math. Supplies were still vanishing. Strength was still fading. The long winter did not care how well people got along. It responded only to action, and even then, without guarantees. So the waiting ended. The decision to seek help beyond the frozen horizon was not dramatic. There was no rallying speech, no swelling music, just a quiet realization that staying still was no longer safer than moving. That remaining inside four wooden walls, however warm with companionship, would eventually become its own kind of surrender. Someone had to go. The men who volunteered, and sometimes were volunteered, did not see themselves as heroes. Heroism implies choice without consequence. This was different. This was arithmetic again. If no one went, everyone suffered. If someone went, they might not return. It was not bravery in the romantic sense. It was obligation sharpened by necessity. The journeys began in silence. Men layered clothing until movement became awkward, faces were wrapped until only eyes remained visible, and even those watered constantly in the cold. Supplies were packed sparingly. You could not carry much when every extra pound drained heat and strength. Food for the journey competed with the food desperately needed back home. There were no speeches at departure. Goodbyes were brief, practical, unfinished. Children were told their fathers or neighbors were going to get help, as if help were a place nearby rather than a distant hope buried under miles of snow. Wives nodded, handed over extra mittens, adjusted scarves. Everyone understood what could not be said aloud. The prairie did not welcome them. Wind cut across open land with surgical precision. Snow hid hazards and erased direction. Familiar paths were gone, landmarks meaningless. The world was reduced to white, gray, and motion. Men navigated by instinct, memory, and stubbornness. Sometimes they followed fence lines. Sometimes they guessed. The cold was not dramatic. It was efficient. Fingers numbed quickly, faces burned, then dulled. Sweat became dangerous, freezing beneath layers. Stopping for rest risked never starting again. Each decision, when to pause, when to push, when to eat, carried weight. Too much caution wasted time. Too little invited collapse. This was not adventure, it was endurance stripped of illusion. Stories later spoke of courage, but in the moment there was only calculation. If I slow now, I won't make it. If I keep going, I might not either. These were not inspiring thoughts. They were simply honest. Some men traveled in pairs, others alone. Horses, when used, suffered terribly. Animals were pushed to their limits, then beyond. More than one journey ended with a man continuing on foot after an animal could go no farther. Survival did not allow sentimentality. Storms arrived without warning. Whiteouts erased even the idea of direction. Men pressed forward blindly, trusting momentum over certainty. Some tied ropes around their waists so others could follow. Some lost sight of their companions and never found them again. The long winter claimed these journeys quietly. There were no witnesses, no last words, just shapes swallowed by weather. Some bodies were never recovered until spring. Others were found where they fell, preserved by cold, expressions frozen somewhere between effort and surprise. The frontier would later call them heroes. At the time, they were simply missing. Those who survived reached rail lines, towns, depots, places that felt almost unreal after so much emptiness. Civilization hummed faintly here. Supplies existed, warmth existed. People were shocked by the stories carried in from the frozen plains, though shock did not always translate into speed. Relief took time. Bureaucracy always does. When food was finally secured, the return journeys began. Heavier, slower, more dangerous. Sacks of flour and cornmeal were lashed together. Every pound mattered. Every step forward was paid for, with strength already in short supply. Men pushed themselves because they had to, because somewhere behind them were families who had turned waiting into a discipline. Because failure was not abstract. It had faces. The return trips were worse. Weather did not soften for bravery. Wind did not pause out of respect. Men stumbled under weight, fighting exhaustion that now had hunger added to it. Mistakes multiplied. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, ears. Pain became distant, replaced by something duller and more dangerous: indifference. Still, they walked. Back home, people waited with a different kind of tension now. Every sound outside could mean salvation or nothing at all. Doors were opened at odd hours, eyes strained against white horizons. Children were hushed. Lamps were kept lit longer just in case. And then, sometimes, impossibly, someone appeared. A figure moving slowly through snowdrifts, a shape leaning forward under burden. Recognition came late, disbelief first, then motion. Doors flew open, voices called out names, people ran despite the cold. Food arrived not as abundance, but as permission to continue. Sacks were opened carefully, reverently. Flour passed hand to hand. Cornmeal measured precisely. No one celebrated wildly. Relief was quiet, restrained, tinged with the awareness of cost. Not everyone who left had returned. Their absence sat heavily among the supplies they had helped secure. Meals improved slightly, not enough to satisfy, but enough to stabilize. Hope, for the first time in months, had something tangible to rest upon. And then, slowly, something else changed. The snow began to behave differently. At first, it was barely noticeable, a softer surface underfoot. Drips from roofs during brief moments of sun, The wind still blew, but it felt less sharp, less committed. People did not comment right away. Experience had taught them caution. But day by day, the snow shifted. It did not vanish dramatically. It sagged. It settled. It grew heavy and tired. Paths emerged where none had existed. Doors opened more easily. The white world lost its crisp authority. The long winter was not ending yet, but it was loosening its grip. People noticed without celebration. They watched, measured, waited. They had learned better than to trust too quickly. Still, something inside them responded. Muscles remembered movement. Minds dared to imagine change. The men who had walked through storms to bring food did not receive speeches. They were fed, wrapped in blankets, allowed to rest. Their heroism, if it could be called that, was absorbed into survival itself. Necessary, costly, and deeply human. Outside, snow began to melt. Not enough to erase what had happened, not enough to undo loss, but enough to signal that the season, relentless as it had been, was not infinite. And in that quiet shift, water dripping from ice, ground slowly re-emerging, the long winter acknowledged something it had resisted for months. Even it eventually had to move on. Winter ends, but no one returns the same. Spring did not arrive with an apology. There was no grand moment when winter admitted defeat, no dramatic retreat of snow in a single triumphant thaw. The long winter ended the same way it had behaved all along. Quietly, without ceremony, almost indifferently. One day, the ground softened enough to leave footprints that did not immediately disappear. Another day, the wind lost its bite. Then, slowly, stubbornly, the white began to recede. People noticed in fragments. A patch of brown earth near a wall, the sound of water moving again, the smell of damp soil rising through layers of melt. These signs were observed carefully, like fragile animals that might flee if acknowledged too quickly. No one celebrated. Celebration required certainty, and certainty had been in short supply for months. Spring came, eventually. It brought light back into rooms that had grown accustomed to shadow. Doors opened wider, windows cleared. The world expanded again beyond four wooden walls. Paths reappeared, distances shortened. Neighbors became neighbors instead of lifelines. And yet something was different. The frontier looked familiar, but it felt altered, as if the land itself remembered what had happened. Snowmelt revealed fences bent and broken, tools left half buried, houses scarred by wind and ice. The environment bore marks of endurance. So did the people. Loss revealed itself quietly. Not everyone who had been present in the fall was there to greet the spring. Some houses remained silent. Some doors stayed closed. Names were spoken less often, not because they were forgotten, but because speaking them required a kind of strength people were still rebuilding. Grief did not announce itself loudly. It settled in, the way winter had. It appeared in small absences. An empty chair, a missing voice, a task that no longer needed doing because the person who once did it was gone. These were not dramatic moments. They were daily ones. The frontier did not pause for mourning. Fields needed tending, repairs demanded attention, life insisted on continuing. People returned to work with bodies that were thinner, weaker, slower. Muscles complained. Energy came in short bursts. Hunger had loosened its grip, but it had left marks behind. Food tasted different now. Meals were fuller, but satisfaction came cautiously. People ate with gratitude and restraint, habits learned too well to abandon easily. Some continued to save scraps long after scarcity had passed. Some flinched at empty shelves, even when they knew supplies were coming. Survival rewires instinct. Conversation shifted. People spoke about the winter, but not constantly. Stories were shared selectively, softened around the edges. Certain details were omitted. Not because they were too horrible to describe, but because they were too familiar. Everyone already knew. The children changed too. They went outside eagerly, clumsily, as if rediscovering space. They ran until exhaustion reminded them that their bodies had limits now. Some carried quiet anxieties, a need to stay close to adults, a sensitivity to cold, an unease when weather darkened unexpectedly. Adults watched them carefully, wondering which lessons would fade and which would remain. The long winter had taught patience brutally. It had taught humility without consent. It had taught people that preparation could fail, that systems could collapse quietly, that endurance had a cost, even when it succeeded. People rebuilt because rebuilding was what they did. But they did so differently. Confidence returned slowly, cautiously. Optimism, once generous, became measured. Plans included contingencies that had not existed before. More food was stored. More wood was chopped. Assumptions were questioned. The frontier ideal of mastery over nature softened into something more realistic. Nature was no longer an opponent to be beaten or an inconvenience to be managed. It was a presence to be respected. Unpredictable, indifferent, capable of patience far beyond human endurance. There was a bitterness beneath the gratitude. Yes, they had survived. Yes, spring had returned. But survival had not come cleanly. It had required compromise, loss, quiet sacrifices that never made it into stories told to outsiders. People who arrived after the winter would hear about it secondhand, framed as hardship overcome, as resilience proven, as an example of frontier toughness. And that version of the story was not wrong. It was just incomplete. Those who lived through it knew the truth was heavier. Survival had changed them in ways that did not announce themselves. Some slept lightly now. Some counted food unconsciously. Some felt uneasy in abundance, as if plenty were temporary by nature. The long winter did not end when the snow melted. It ended gradually, unevenly, inside people. Neighbors remained closer than before, though the urgency had faded. Bonds formed in desperation do not dissolve easily. Shared memory has weight. A look exchanged across a field carried understanding that required no explanation. And yet life resumed its forward motion. New challenges replaced old ones. The frontier demanded attention again. The land did not care what it had taken. There was a quiet irony in how quickly the world moved on. Grass grew, crops were planted, markets reopened. The season of suffering became a memory faster than anyone expected. The prairie, vast and indifferent, absorbed the past without comment. People stood in the sunlight, feeling warmth on their faces, and tried to reconcile it with months of cold that still lived in their bones. They had survived. But survival, they now understood, was not a finish line. It was not a victory parade. It was a state of being that left residue behind. Habits, fears, silences. They lived. They endured. And quietly, honestly, they learned something history rarely says out loud. They survived. But surviving is not always the same thing as winning. The long winter and the lesson history never says out loud. History does not raise its voice when it teaches. It does not shout warnings or underline conclusions. It leaves traces instead. Patterns, silences, habits, passed quietly from one generation to the next. The long winter of 1880 is one of those lessons. It is rarely announced as a turning point. It does not arrive wrapped in speeches or monuments, and yet it lingers, precisely because of how quietly it unfolded. The winter did not introduce humanity to suffering. People already knew cold, hunger, fear, loss. What it revealed instead was something subtler, how fragile confidence can be when it rests on assumptions rather than humility. Frontier families believed they understood winter. They had survived it before. They had planned for it. They had respected it, or at least thought they had. And that belief, more than any shortage of food or fuel, shaped what followed. The long winter did not punish ignorance. It exposed certainty. Human beings are remarkably good at mistaking familiarity for control. The frontier encouraged that mistake. It rewarded courage, initiative, persistence. It told people that the world could be shaped by effort and will, and often it could. Crops grew, homes stood, communities formed. Success reinforced the narrative. The land seemed to cooperate just enough to make confidence feel earned. The long winter interrupted that story. It did not arrive to destroy, but to endure. It outlasted planning. It outpaced preparation. It ignored the careful balance people believed they had struck with nature. And in doing so, it revealed a truth that still makes us uncomfortable. Resilience is not dominance. Survival is not mastery. The people who lived through that winter did not fail. They adapted, they shared, they endured quietly, creatively, painfully. But they also learned, often too late, that systems built for normal conditions collapse quickly when normal disappears. This is not a lesson people enjoy repeating. History prefers clear villains, obvious mistakes, moments where everything could have gone differently if only someone had acted sooner. The long winter offers none of that comfort. No single decision caused it. No one ignored a warning sign that would have saved everyone. People behaved reasonably, sensibly, humanely, and still they suffered. That is why the story unsettles us. It suggests that intelligence, preparation, and good intentions are not always enough, that nature does not negotiate, that patience can be as dangerous as panic when it becomes denial. These are not heroic lessons. They are humbling ones. The long winter also teaches us something about endurance that rarely makes it into inspirational language. Endurance is not always loud or triumphant. Sometimes it is quiet and shrinking. Sometimes it looks like smaller meals, slower movements, fewer words. Sometimes it leaves scars that no one else can see. Those who survived carried the winter with them long after the snow melted, in habits, in caution, in a subtle mistrust of abundance. The season passed, but its influence did not, and that, perhaps, is the most honest outcome history can offer. We often ask what the past can teach us. The long winter answers softly. It teaches us limits. It teaches us that confidence without flexibility becomes vulnerability, that systems built for efficiency fail under persistence, that hope must be adjusted, not abandoned, when reality refuses to cooperate. It teaches us that cooperation matters, but it does not eliminate risk. That heroism is often quiet, incomplete, and sometimes unrewarded. Most of all, it teaches us that history does not need spectacle to be dangerous. The long winter did not roar. It waited, and in waiting it revealed something deeply human. Our tendency to believe that what has always ended will always end on time, that tomorrow will explain itself. That discomfort is temporary simply because it usually has been. History does not correct that belief loudly. It whispers instead, through seasons like this one, through families who endured without fanfare, through stories passed down, softened, simplified, until only the outline remains. And if we listen carefully, we can still hear it. Not as a warning meant to frighten, but as a reminder meant to ground us. Because the longest winter is not always the one outside the door. Sometimes, the longest winter is the one we refuse to believe can last.